Hello everyone, Tom Simmons here again with another installment of Sports Economics. And this video that I'm making today will be the first of a series of 5 videos where each video will look very specifically at one of the major professional sports leagues. And the purpose of the video and the information that we're going to be sharing is to give you a better idea of the structure and the differences in structures between the different professional sports and how that plays out in terms of the economics of those particular sports. Now, today I'm going to start with Major League Baseball. And baseball has been around so long, since before the Civil War, that we could spend days and days talking about the stories and the structure of Major League Baseball and how it's changed throughout the years. So what I'm going to do in this video is touch on some of the major factors that have shaped Major League Baseball, organized baseball, as it is today. So the National League, we often think of Major League Baseball as being divided into 2 leagues, right? The National League and the American League. And the National League itself was organized in 1876, and the American League in 1901. And there were some leagues, some groupings of teams before then, and efforts at putting together some additional leagues even beyond them. But they've been around for a long time. And it obviously became necessary for some of the local teams and owners to begin to work with each other in order to develop baseball as an organized as opposed to a disorganized sport. For instance, some of you may be familiar with the fact that the rules in baseball were actually very diverse in the mid-1800s. And there were 2 different sets of rules that were developing as to how to play the game. There were the New York rules, which are often called the Knickerbocker rules, and there were the Massachusetts rules. And the Massachusetts rules might seem even bizarre to some of you today. You got players out by throwing the ball at them and hitting them. Instead of a diamond, the 4 bases were arranged in a square. You won the game by getting 100 runs or by getting everyone on the opposing team out by hitting them with a ball. The runners didn't have to stay in the baselines. There was no foul territory. So, as you can see, if you're playing with that set of rules against a team that's observing the New York or Knickerbocker rules, which is essentially what we have today. That's the group of rules that actually have carried the day. You'd have a very confusing game. And so your leagues began to organize largely to make some sense out of the differences between the teams and the leagues and the geography, and also to establish some sort of common message and common marketing and common professionalism within the sport itself. Now, ironically, even though we still talk about the National League and the American League, a lot of people don't realize that as legal entities, those 2 leagues were actually dissolved in the year 2000. There technically is no legal National League or legal American League anymore. They used to each have their own president. They don't exist anymore. All of the teams are under organized baseball or a part of organized Major League Baseball. And we continue to talk in terms of the American League and the National League largely as almost as a marketing shtick. Who's going to win the pennant this year? The only real difference between them being the designated hitter rule, which is unique to baseball. That's just the way it is. But technically, as legal entities, they're more like conferences, as you have a football conference, than they are leagues. There's one Major League Baseball organization now. and the commissioner of that organization for more than 20 years has been Bud Selig. So you have this need, and you've always had a need for the teams to get together to decide what are the rules, who's in our league, how do we set up a schedule. Obviously, it's necessary for the teams to talk to each other in order to be able to present some coherent schedule to the world, so people know who's playing, where they're playing, who the members the members of the overall league are. But in doing that, that means that clubs that are normally in competition with each other are in essence getting together and saying, here's who our members are going to be, and here's how we're going to do things together. Now, in the late 1800s, Congress passed a law called the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the relationship between baseball and the application of this law has a long, long history that continues to affect what goes on in baseball. So let me read to you the most important part of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was enacted in 1890. And this was enacted at a time when there were enormous railroads crossing the country. Big oil companies, big railroad companies, a lot of very large companies. And Congress was afraid of monopolization, or that some of these companies would get together and start making deals with each other that would hurt consumers in the long run. So if one railroad said, hey, we'll run between New York and Chicago, and we'll let you run between Washington and Atlanta, and you don't compete with us and we won't compete with you, we'll each have a monopoly in our own area. This was the kind of thing the Sherman Antitrust Act was meant to address. They didn't want large companies making deals and giving each other little monopolies. So the Act says that every contract or conspiracy in restraint of trade or commerce among the several states is declared to be illegal. A business cannot act in a way so as to restrain trade or prevent competition. You have to allow competition. You can't restrain trade. You can't fix prices. If you're going to be in competition with each other, then you're going to be in competition with each other. You're not going to engage in conspiracies against the consumer. Second section says that every person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize or conspire with any other person or persons to monopolize any part of the trade or commerce among the several states shall be deemed guilty of a felony. And the Act makes it further clear that a person under the law does not just mean an individual person, but that the word person or persons in this Act shall be deemed to include corporations and associations. So no person, and that means a corporation or an association or a group, can conspire with any other group to stifle competition, to prevent competition, to restrain trade. So that was passed in 1890, and it didn't take too long before the issue of, well, the way baseball operates by getting together and deciding who can be part of a league and who can't be part of a league, who plays in the schedule, is that subject to these provisions of the Sherman Antitrust Act. And there are 3 major lawsuits that made it all the way to the United States Supreme Court that address this very specific issue. The very first one was in 1922, and it was called the Federal Baseball Club of Baltimore versus the National League of Professional Baseball Clubs. Most people just refer to this as the Federal Baseball Club decision. And what happened back in the 1920s is that there was a new league formed, because there have been other leagues besides the American and the National, and this was called the Federal League. And one of their clubs was called the Federal Baseball Club of Baltimore. And there were 7 of them in this league, playing against each other. Well, when the National League saw that another league was forming, they didn't like having competition. And so some of the National League bought some of the Federal League clubs and offered them some very lucrative contracts to come join the National League. By the time they had got done raiding the Federal League, there was only one club left, and that was this Baltimore club. So the Baltimore club took them to court and said, this is exactly what the Sherman Antitrust Act is supposed to prevent: monopolization. By spending big money and by luring all of our members into your national club, you basically monopolized the baseball business. Well, it was a very interesting decision because there was a unanimous Supreme Court decision when it got to them. And what they said, and this is directly from their decision, in talking about the baseball business, they said the business is giving exhibitions of baseball, which are purely state affairs. It is true that in order to attain for these exhibitions the great popularity that they have achieved, competitions must be arranged between clubs from different cities and states. But the fact that in order to give their exhibitions, the leagues must induce persons to cross state lines and must arrange and pay for their doing so is not enough to change the character of the business. The transport is mere incident, not the essential thing. What the court said is that this is a purely local state issue, baseball games. And that's important because the Sherman Antitrust Act prohibited monopolization and conspiracy to restrain trade among or between the states, crossing state lines. And the court found unanimously that even though baseball players and teams and fans were crossing state lines, that wasn't interstate commerce, and the Sherman Antitrust Act really didn't apply. So as a result, they gave an exemption to baseball in 1922 from this act that said basically it's okay to monopolize, it's okay to restrain trade, it's okay for you to be really the monopoly provider of professional baseball. This is going to have major impact as we move into the future. And the next time the Supreme Court gets to address this issue is in 1953. So we're going to move ahead 30 years. 1953, there was another case, and this was Toolson versus the New York Yankees. And again, this is usually referred to as the Toolson case. George Toolson was a player in a farm league for the New York Yankees. And that farm league was located in Newark, New Jersey. And the Yankees decided to dissolve this farm league, and they assigned George Toolson to an even lower level minor league team in upstate New York. Well, he thought he was better than that. He didn't think he should be relegated to some really minor league, and he wanted the right to negotiate with some other major league team in order to play for them. Problem at the time was that contracts between players and the owners had something called a reserve clause. You've probably heard that phrase. And the reserve clause basically says that the team with whom you contract reserves the right to your services, and they can prevent you from negotiating with another team or leaving to go to another team. In essence, they kind of own your being. And Toolson said this is a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act because you're restraining trade. Took it to court, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court again, and once again, by a vote of 7-2, the U.S. Supreme Court held that the Sherman Antitrust Act does not apply to baseball. And the reasoning they used this time, they didn't really argue strongly that it was a state affair, but what they argued was, hey, look, 30 years ago, we said this was a state affair, and that the Sherman Antitrust Act was not meant to cover baseball. If Congress thought we were wrong, they had 30 years to change the law and say, oh, yes, it is meant to cover baseball. And they've chosen not to act. So since they've chosen not to act for 30 years since our last decision, obviously we must have made the right decision, and this is the way they want it. So this time, split court, 7-2, they said, sorry, you have no right to negotiate with another team, Mr. Toolson. The reserve clause stands because baseball has the right to create a monopoly with its business. So now we move the clock ahead to the 1970s. Another 20 years forward. And this is 1972. This case is called Flood versus Kuhn. And those two individuals being Curt Flood, who was a center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, and Bowie Kuhn, who was the baseball commissioner at the time. And what happened in this case was that Flood was told in a telephone call by his owners, hey, we traded you. You're going to Philadelphia Phillies next year. And Flood said, like heck I am. You can't just trade me like I'm some, a piece of cattle. And once again, it went to court, and it went to the Supreme Court based on the idea that baseball should not be exempt from this anti-monopolization statute. Once again, the Supreme Court affirmed their earlier decision. But this time, it was a much, much more fractured court. In fact, the first couple pages of the decision, you get the idea that the judges are actually having a good time with their decision. They write a history of baseball and all the baseball greats. And they talk about Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, and they go on and on, waxing eloquent about this wonderful national sport. When they get done with this entire ode to baseball, they actually admit that baseball is, in fact, engaged in interstate commerce. Right in the body of the decision, they say, professional baseball is a business, and it's engaged in interstate commerce. But in respect to federal antitrust laws, baseball is an exception to the law. And once again, they say, look, we made this decision back in the 1920s. It is now the 1970s. Congress has not changed the law. They have not overturned our decision. They've done nothing. So we're not going to change it. The decision, however, was very, very fractured. It was a 5-3 decision. The 5 justices in the majority divided and wrote 2 separate opinions, 3 on one, 2 on another. 3 justices said this is ridiculous, and 1 justice didn't take part. So Over the course of the years, the court has seen more and more that, of course, this is a national, if not an international business at this point. But we decided years ago that anti-monopolization statutes do not apply to baseball. And if Congress wants to change that, they're going to have to change that. What's really unique is that within the decision, they actually said, we've given this exemption to baseball, but not to football or basketball or any other sport. Those are very clearly interstate commerce, and the act applies. And if you're shaking your head and you say that makes no sense, how can baseball not be interstate commerce and not have this act apply, but football is? You and the rest of the world are pretty much in agreement. This is just a very, very odd exception. It has given organized baseball a lot of power and authority to make decisions about issues such as where franchises are going and whether they can move or not. And that power, that authority, tends to be vested in the owners themselves. The owners are the ones who make these decisions, who vote on the baseball commissioner, and who very much are in the driver's seat, probably more so than in any of the other organized professional sports. So, to give you an example as to how that plays out, let's go to one more, leave antitrust for a second, and talk about the Fay Vincent years. Fay Vincent was the commissioner of baseball for a very short period of time, 1989 to 1992. He barely lasted 3 years. And that's because he tangled with the owners. Right after he came into the office of as commissioner of baseball, after they voted him in, there was a lockout. Now, the difference between a lockout and a strike is this. If the players had said, we're not playing until we get better benefits, that would be a strike. When the owners say, we're not starting, you're not playing, that's a lockout. It just depends on who's actually doing the action. Well, the owners engaged in a lockout against their players who were looking for better benefits. Fay Vincent, as commissioner of baseball, stepped in to try and save the season and to negotiate differences between the owners and the players. Well, one of the things he did was he negotiated a raise to the minimum salary level. At the time, the minimum salary that you could pay a baseball player, and this was around 1990, was $68,000. And Fay Vincent upped that to $100,000. Owners overall were furious. He also established a commission to begin looking at ways to transfer money out of rich clubs to poorer clubs. As you can imagine, that outraged a lot of the owners, especially the owners of the wealthier clubs. It's my team, it's my money. What do you mean you're establishing a 6-member commission to look into how to take my money? This is welfare. And in fact, that's exactly one of the words that was used to describe the effort to move revenue away from the local clubs to the organization for distribution back to the poorer clubs. He also banned George Steinbrenner, owner of the New York Yankees, for life, which did not endear him to George Steinbrenner. And then there was a pitcher named Steve Howe, who was also banned for drug use. And some of the owners and managers, once again, a Yankee issue, were so outraged at that action that they actually went to court and testified on behalf of Steve Howe. Fay Vincent was outraged and told them, that he was even thinking about banning those managers from the Yankees for life from the game for coming against him. Well, in baseball, you don't do that because the owners have a lot of say. And 3 months after that incident, the owners came together and they voted 18-9 in a vote of no confidence to get rid of Fay Vincent. The entire campaign was led by 5 owners, who are often called the Great Lakes Gang. One of them was the owner of the Chicago White Sox. One of them was the owner of the Chicago Cubs. One of them was the owner of the Minnesota Twins. One of them was the owner of the LA Dodgers, which is not in the Great Lakes, but they're still called the Great Lakes Gang. And one of them was Bud Selig, who was president of the Milwaukee Brewers. And they're the ones who led the campaign to get rid of Fay Vincent as being too friendly to players and the organization and not friendly to the owner's interests. Fay Vincent resigned after saying he never would. And the very next thing that happened, on a unanimous vote, Bud Selig was voted by the owners as the next commissioner of baseball. And he's been the commissioner of baseball ever since, with expectations that he's going to step down in 2015 very soon. That shows you some of the impact and the power that the owners have within baseball in directing their overall organization. So, you've got this antitrust protection that allows them to monopolize, and you've got this power of the vote of the owners to decide what's going to happen at the commissioner level. So one way this plays out is they protect each other, quite frankly. In 2001, the owners voted to contract the league. They decided they wanted to reduce the size of Major League Baseball by 2 teams. And the 2 teams that looked like they were going to get the hatchet were the Minnesota Twins and the Montreal Expos. It took a few years for this to play out. In the end, the Montreal Expos did in fact leave Montreal and wanted to establish themselves in Washington, D.C. So the Expos became the Nationals, but as you can imagine, one team was not happy about that, and that would be the Baltimore Orioles, because Baltimore and Washington are barely an hour's drive apart from each other and share a lot of the same media markets. And so part of the deal, once the Baltimore Orioles objected to Montreal Expos moving to D.C., part of the deal was that the Montreal Expos had to pay $75 million to the Baltimore Orioles for infringing on their media territory. And these kind of things continue to happen in baseball, where the owners decide whether to expand or contract, and what happens if you want to move your team from one place to another. Now, on a parallel track, and around the same time, you'll remember I said that Fay Vincent had established a commission to look into ways to share revenue between the teams. And so this actually did happen, and ironically it happened under Bud Selig's term as commissioner, so that baseball now has a revenue sharing system. And I need to explain, take the rest of the time in this video to explain how that works. Poorer teams complained that without more money to upgrade their stadiums or to pay their players or pay for training, that they needed some of the money that the wealthier teams were always bringing in. And so Major League Baseball came up with a revenue sharing scheme to transfer money from the wealthier clubs to the poorer clubs. The way this works is any money that the national Major League Baseball organization brings in, so let's say national broadcasts, if they get money from a national broadcast, that money comes to the central offices, and then it's just divided equally to all the teams in Major League Baseball. No one really seems to object to that. And they do that with the national broadcasts, and they also do it with the licensing, anything that's got a Major League Baseball logo on it. Where there was a lot more objection and concern and arguments is when they implemented a rule that 31% of local revenues, largely gate receipts and concession sales, 31% would be taken from the local teams to the central office and then redistributed to the not-so-wealthy teams. So, some teams are in very large media markets. For instance, in the year 2013, the Yankees received $23.8 million from the national pool for national broadcasts. They received $90 million from local New York City area broadcasting affiliates. So what this has done is, it has given the teams a real incentive to have very high local revenues because they're only giving away 31% of that, and it's a much bigger cash cow for them. If there is a contract with a national broadcaster who wants to broadcast a game, but there's a local broadcaster who also wants to broadcast the game, the local broadcaster has the right, and the national broadcaster is blacked out. So even though baseball teams are sharing the revenue they receive, 31% of the local revenue, they are amassing large amounts of local revenue because they still get to keep 69% of that. So the more revenue they can create locally, the more they can get to keep themselves and not have to share it. This is why if you have a corporate suite and the corporation rents it for $500,000 a year and there's 20 seats in it, the team technically only has to share the value of the ticket value of 20 seats. Whereas the full $500,000 they get for the rental of the suite stays home with them. That's a stadium revenue, and that stays home with them. They don't have to share the ticket receipts for that whole suite. It means that there's more incentive for a baseball team to buy a media corporation, or for an owner to own a baseball team in a media corporation. Because just like the last video that I shared with you, if they can funnel money out of the baseball team and into the media corporation, none of that has to get shared. Because the media corporation isn't a baseball team, so nothing's shared. So, yes, there's revenue sharing in baseball. National contracts get shared equally among everyone. Local revenue, largely gate receipts and concession sales, 31% go to the national office for redistribution to poorer teams. But if you can keep your money at home by calling it a stadium receipt, like boxes, like stadium naming rights. Used to be that how long ago that stadiums were never named after corporations? Most of them are today, because that money stays home with the locals. If you can get a local broadcaster to cover your game instead of a national, you get a local broadcaster to cover your game. You get to keep more of the money. If you can own a a media company that will broadcast it, you may be able to keep all of your money. And that's what these regional sports networks are, or RSNs, as it's called for short. So, one last anecdote for you. Just another court case just happened in August of 2014, not that long ago. You may be aware that the Oakland Athletics, the Oakland A's, have been looking to move out of that city, and the city of San Jose wants them, and wants them badly. However, the San Francisco Giants object. The San Francisco Giants have said, no, the city of San Jose is our media market. You can't move there. And because the owners of the San Francisco Giants said, no, we're against that, Bud Selig, commissioner of baseball, has taken San Francisco's side and said, no, can't go against my owners. And he won't, and he's not helping the Oakland A's move to San Jose. San Jose, the city of San Jose, and the Oakland A's have sued Bud Selig and Major League Baseball, alleging an infringement on Sherman Antitrust Act by saying they're monopolizing. There's no other business in the world where McDonald's and Burger King could get together and say to Wendy's, you're not allowed in our city, or you can't move there. Whatever happened to competition? Well, this was just heard in August 2014, and it was a panel of 3 judges, and by all media reports, those 3 judges basically are very, very skeptical of the Oakland A's argument that this is a violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act. In fact, every indication is that these judges are going to say what all the judges for the almost last 100 years have said. Baseball is unique. Baseball is exempt. They can monopolize. They can call the shots. They can make the decisions, and we're going to keep our hands off. But we're going to keep an ear out to see if there's if that court decision comes down anytime soon. But that's what I expect is going to happen. That's what most observers of the court expect is going to happen. So they continue to give this strength to baseball. And a lot of that strength is not so much in the commissioner's office as it is in the owners who hire, fire, make the decisions, arrange their business so that local income is kept local, or not even part of the revenue sharing system because of their involvement in regional sports networks, the broadcast networks. And that's the structure of baseball. It's not that way in the other leagues, as you'll see over the course of the next 4 videos. All right, Tom Simmons, hopefully that was somewhat clear or clarified or even piqued your interest to look at some of these issues even deeper.